In this third part of our introduction to American media history, we're going to look at the British roots of free expression because, of course, the British roots are the American roots. So in 1643, under the rule of Charles I, Parliament passed a very strict licensing law that was enforced by the Stationers' Company. John Milton, who you may know as the author of Paradise Lost, was among the worst offenders of the licensing laws. He wrote many pamphlets of outrage against Charles I and the church on marriage and divorce. He was very unhappy with his young wife and wanted to divorce her, but adultery was the only reason that was allowed. He thought this was ignorant and silly, and said that the church's threats of licensing to silence opposing voices were crimes against humanity. In 1644, he published something called the Areopagitica, a pamphlet for the liberty of unlicensed printing. It has been called the finest argument ever written against the stupidities and futilities of censorship. In the Areopagitica, Milton argued that when truth and falsehood meet in the marketplace of ideas, truth always wins. He called this the self-righting principle. There is no authority needed to determine and disseminate truth. He argued that understanding, goodness, and decency can only come by taking all sides into consideration. Now consider how revolutionary these ideas were. We talked in the first segment about the idea that under authoritarian rule, truth came from God through the king and was disseminated, and there was no argument, there was no dissent allowed. In fact, how could you dissent against the crown or against the church when what they were claiming was in fact straight from God? So there's a whole change now in thinking about where truth comes from and the ability of human beings to determine truth, as opposed to accepting it solely from an authoritarian source. As far back as the 1640s, these ideas formed the underpinnings of American journalism. The next two major thinkers whose ideas contributed to the American experiment were Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. So let's look at Thomas Hobbes first. He developed the idea of the social contract in his publication Leviathan in 1651. And again, this has been called an underpinning of the American experiment. Hobbes argued that people are rational, but self-interested and depraved. And that is a state of nature. The solution to controlling people and to eliminating chaos is the Commonwealth. He believed that without a supreme authority, a monarchy, chaos would reign. But the Commonwealth was different. It meant that there was a contract or an agreement between the state and the people. A Commonwealth, the state agrees to provide a safe and peaceful society, and in return, citizens willingly swear obedience to the authority. Even if there's a hard life under the authority, it's better than the chaotic state of nature. Now, this may not sound like anything like our democracy, but it is the idea of the social contract, which had never been thought of before in terms of monarchs. 100 years later, John Locke came along and took Hobbes's ideas of a social contract even further. He claimed there's no such thing as a divine right of kings, and that in fact there's nothing worse than being subjected to the will of another. He said that rulers, the monarchs, lose the right to govern if they ignore the needs of those they are governing. So two of his ideas are associated with the American belief system and underlie our idea of journalism. His contract theory says that government thrives under the consent of the governed. Truly a radical notion when you compare it to authoritarian ruling systems. And the second part was the right of revolution. Not only do people have the right, but they have the duty to overthrow tyrannical leaders by force and violence if necessary. He believed that the best government is run by lawmakers, not by monarchs. I mean, just think how radical these ideas of John Locke's were. He didn't advocate democracy, certainly not as we know it, but commonwealth. He believed that individuals had the right and responsibility to pursue their own civil interests, and it is from him we get the words life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in our Declaration of Independence. On the other hand, he had no toleration for those who would disrupt the Commonwealth. He believed that there must be a civil society, and he did not believe or tolerate sedition or actions contrary to the public peace. There's another source of ideas behind the American experiment and American journalism, and they are publications that were written under pseudonym called Cato's Letters, and these were written between 1720 and 1723. The authors under the pseudonyms were John Trenchard and Thomas Gordon. They wrote about religious and personal freedom, the right of citizens, and the responsibility of government to protect its citizens. No one had seriously published ideas before about religious and personal freedom and rights of citizens before Locke and Trenchard and Gordon. They approved of libel against the government because the public has the responsibility to expose what they called public wickedness. These exposures could never be libel because exposures would be true. That is completely against the laws that had been in place since 1275 in England. Remember, we said that no slander was allowed. It didn't matter if it was true or not. Well, here you have people saying that if it's true, it couldn't be libelous, it couldn't be slanderous. And in fact, people had a responsibility to expose these kinds of bad things that were going on. And this, in fact, formed the essence of Andrew Hamilton's defense of the John Peter Zenger, who was a printer in America in 1735. Andrew Hamilton was brought in to defend Zenger, who was just, printing somebody else's ideas, really. But Hamilton said there must be freedom of thought and speech, and there must be political criticism allowed. There is an obligation and the right of the press to engage in political criticism, to condemn harm by the government that injures people. And this idea led to what we call the Fourth Estate, or the idea that the press is the watchdog on the government. No 18th century work was more important in influencing the history of political liberty and freedom of speech and of the press. And I think you can see as you look through these ideas that these were very much in the mind of Thomas Jefferson and the other founding fathers as they tried to figure out, how do we do this American experiment and what is the role of the press in the process?